Hello, listeners. Today we're going to be discussing the dire wolf de-extinction that happened recently and the company who did that, Colossal. Colossal is the genetic engineering company, and some of their notable projects are trying to resurrect the mammoth. You may have seen the woolly mice headlines as well. That was also Colossal. First of all, who am I? I'm an undergraduate student at the University of Iowa, and I was recently accepted into the undergraduate research fellowship program that they have, and I'm going to be working on Dolly the mastodon that was found in the southern part of the state last August. I've been volunteering in the paleontology repository since September. It's safe to say I'm just a little interested in paleontology. So why should we care about this? Mostly just because Colossal kinda sorta lied to the public, and we'll get into that in the interview. De-extinction science is relatively new and unknown to the public. The headlines only really scratch the surface of the science. So, who am I going to be interviewing? I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Christopher Brochu. He is a paleontologist and paleontology professor at the University of Iowa. He has worked on non-mammalian creatures mostly, including Sue, the T-Rex at the Field Museum in Chicago. He has been a paleontologist for decades, so he knows his stuff. What do you think about de-extinction efforts in general across any species, and is there any merit to the science?
Well, it depends on what you mean by de-extinction. For example, there's the whole rewilding concept, but also there's, talking about...
In this context, it would be Colossal.
That company is doing more than just the dire wolf stuff. I disagree with a lot of what they're doing on the dire wolf stuff. There's different ways that you can think about de-extinction. There's true cloning, which I don't oppose because I think it's dangerous. I oppose it because it's going to be a waste of time. It's just not feasible. What Colossal has done, it is cool. I mean, they were able to genetically engineer a wolf.
Absolutely, yeah.
What they created was not a dire wolf. What they created was a GMO wolf. They were able to modify some of the genes in gray wolf genome in ways that mimic certain genes in the dire wolf. The resulting pups are gray wolf pups, but some of their genes have been modified in ways that they were going to claim is dire wolf-like. Now, I have to say, I am really disappointed in how Colossal managed the media release of this.
Yeah.
Because they said some things that are just flat out incorrect. I mean, they said, to follow a phenotypic approach towards species definitions. No, nobody does that. They said, some do this, but we do that. No. The way I sometimes put it is, if you wanted to kill a lot of biologists, lock them in a room and say no one gets out until you all agree on what a species is. They will all die. But if you look at all of the species definitions that are out there, concepts, they boil down to three. There's the evolutionary species concept, which is a lineage of ancestor-descendant populations evolving over time. There's the phylogenetic, which is basically a smallest diagnosable unit, which is kind of sort of what they're toward, but what they're doing is actually very different from how it's used in biology. And then there's the biological species concept, which is what everyone learns in high school, but no biologist actually ever uses.
Yeah.
Which is the reproductively isolated population that breeds true, right? Basically, if you think about it, evolutionary species is what a species is. It's essentialistic. That's what it is. Phylogenetic species is epistemological. That's how we know we have a species. Biological species is teleological. That's how a species comes into being, at least for sexually reproducing organisms. Okay, so if you think about it, our phylogenetic species are the operational quote-unquote species that we hope approximate real evolutionary species that came into being through reproductive isolation. And they also were saying, this looks like a dire wolf. How therefore do they know that?
I wanted to ask about that. I have my own conspiracy about why they made the dire wolves white, and I think...
Keyword, but I'll listen to you.
I think it's totally because of their appearance in Game of Thrones being white.
A few episodes. I think Game of Thrones is the cheap knockoff of Tolkien myself, but that's just me.
Yeah.
I was aware of that. I was aware that the dire wolves are white.
I think that's why.
That actually could be. I mean, I've seen white poodles. That doesn't mean they're dire wolf-like, are they? So,
yeah.
I think what they've done is they've created a genetically modified gray wolf. See, they also said, the dire wolf and the gray wolf are the closest relatives. They're not.
Yeah, not by a long shot.
No. Everyone assumed it was Canis dirus, just a bigger version of a wolf.
Yeah.
And it's actually not Canis at all. It's much more distantly related. And when it comes to trying to recreate or resurrect extinct species, first of all, the only legitimate reason I can find to de-extinctify something is because it would be really cool to have.
Yeah, yeah.
It really would. But when it comes to rewilding, unless it's something that went extinct in the last couple of hundred years, that's just not going to happen.
Yeah, with the woolly mammoth was like their capital project. Did you think woolly mammoth could even survive in the modern climate?
Well, I'm sure it could survive some.
Like Siberia, maybe.
The example I often give is Mustangs, because they're often pointed to as an example of rewilding that works, except it's not. Two reasons. First of all, the horses we had in North America up until about 10,000 years ago didn't look like those. They were mostly smaller. They've often been sometimes called North American zebras, even though we don't know if they had stripes. But if you look at a zebra, compare a zebra with the average thoroughbred or whatever, modern, the most domestic horses aren't nearly as stocky. They have this flowing mane, this flowing tail. Wild ones don't do that. The modern horses that we have out there, they're not descended from those wild horses. They're not that close.
An invasive species, really.
Right, it's an invasive species. And on top of that, the area where the Mustangs are currently roaming in the Great Basin area out west didn't look like that 10,000 years ago. Grasses out there now are invasive grasses. They didn't exist back then. It was a lot wetter back then. It wasn't nearly as hot. And so the rewilding, you're trying to reintroduce something into the environment where it belongs. Well, first of all, the environment is not the same, and the horses aren't the same. And so in that context, it's not rewilding, because you're not reintroducing something that's missing from a given habitat. You're taking something that was never in a particular habitat and moving it there. Whenever there has been true rewilding, it's come with controversy. An example of that would be the gray wolves in Yellowstone.
Yep, and all the livestock issues.
Right, I mean, gray wolves belong there, and they are a key part of the environment, but they do sometimes take livestock. And we have to acknowledge that there are animal-human conflicts. I deal with this with crocodilians all the time. Wildlife conflict is an issue. So if you do manage to recreate something that's extinct, whether it's through genetic engineering, which is what Colossal's trying to do, or is it through selective breeding, which some have argued, which I think is completely not de-extinction. That's creation of something brand new.
And that'd take a long while as well.
Or if you're trying true cloning, which is bloody difficult, what do you do with them? You keep them in a zoo. You want to keep them in a zoo or some sort of enclosed space, fine.
Yeah.
But and part of the reason they're going to fail, I think, there's a couple of reasons they'll fail with the mammoth. One, gestation time and generation time. It's a couple of years.
Yeah, it's a long project.
It's why biologists use fruit flies and not rhino. The other reason is that the closest relative of the mammoth is the Asian elephant.
They're like way smaller.
The African elephant's not even Elephas. It's Loxodon. It's a lot of money for very low likelihood of payoff. Because the dire wolf, I think, again, it's one of those things that would be really great to see a live one.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's a piece of biodiversity that is now gone. And I would love to see all these things. These hoofed crocs that went extinct in the Eocene. God, I want to see one.
Yeah, that'd be pretty bizarre.
Yeah, I think there needs to be some sort of control. For example, what if someone decides to clone an early form of human?
Exactly, yeah, like a Neanderthal or something. What happens?
Or something even more basal than that. I mean, does that person have rights?
Yeah, that's one of the ethical questions. We've been talking a lot about the ethics of how it interacts with humans. I was wondering about the ethics for the animals involved, and would it be ethical to bring back like the mammoth, for example, and put it wherever we could find a place for it and have it live its life in a completely alien way to its ancestors? That's
a really great question. I think it's a two-step question. One, should we bring these things back to life? And second, what do we do with them? And with anything, I think rewilding, in my opinion, when it comes to that sort of thing, unless it's something that only went extinct in the last, or locally in the last few hundred years, so that the environment is still kind of sane.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay, fine. If you wanted to bring something back, and just for, I don't want to say just entertainment value, because that's kind of...
Yeah, put a mammoth in a circus.
Well, or in a zoo.
Yeah, a zoo would count as well.
And in my opinion, the other issue is the expense. I don't know how much they spent, but how much of that can be directed toward preserving habitat so that we have fewer extinctions.
Exactly.
That to me is a very compelling argument. It's really, these efforts are seriously expensive.
The technology is very, very expensive for just small edits.
Because again, you don't just put the DNA in a test tube, shake it, and then something crawls out. You have to have a surrogate, and that surrogate has to be closely enough related that it's not just going to chuck the embryo as a foreign body.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so there's all those problems that are really hard to circumvent, and it's a lot of money. Again, when I say it can't be done, I want to be wrong. That would be great, but there's so much involved that I'm not convinced the cost and the effort is worth it. Efficacy, as opposed to practicality, efficacy is an issue, okay? So if this company wants to spend a whole lot of money trying to clone or genetically re-engineer, which is exactly actually what they're doing, a dire wolf, okay, it's a private company, they can use their funds however they wish, that's the way it works. But what else can we be doing with those resources? Trying to protect other wild canids, other wild dogs that might be imperiled. I don't think de-extinction is necessarily going to create
apathy towards
that's the word I'm looking for, apathy. I don't think it's going to create that, because I just don't think I don't think cloning is going to be all that successful. But
and that is a totally valid point to make. It's kind of retroactive conservation.
I wouldn't call it retroactive, I would call it restoration.
Or restoration, yeah.
But restoration comes with, people say, well, we recreated a wetland. Yeah, but does it look like the wetland that you drained?
It's not the same as before, yeah. The last thing I wanted to touch on here was with the media outside of Colossal's marketing themselves. I'm talking like how CNN or Business Insider or New York Times, how all these news outlets portrayed the whole de-extinction. My first reaction was, it's total BS. We do not have dire wolves. So I wanted to know, how do you think that has affected people's view of de-extinction and, to a lesser or maybe greater extent, paleontology?
Most of the people I know are paleontologists, and we all kind of think alike, right? I think most of us were very dismissive. I'm like, that's not a dire wolf. And some of us got kind of disgruntled when we got onto, I'm not heavy into social media, but I do go on Facebook sometimes. And I saw some of my high school friends who aren't into the sciences, or family members, or in-laws mostly actually, saying, well, hey, this is really kind of neat. And I would have to explain, well, actually, here's what's really going on. What I will say about the media, though, is that if something sensational comes out and it's very quickly argued against, the media will cover some of that if it's immediate. Let me give you an example. When I was a postdoc at the Field Museum back in, this would have been like 99 or something, a paper was about to be published claiming that there was a dinosaur fossil that had a preserved heart.
Interesting.
It was coming out in Nature, and they asked me what I thought. And I looked at the paper, and I said, I called the reporter back like, that's not a heart. That's a concretion. That's a geological structure. That's got fuck all to do with a heart.
Yeah.
And they were like, but some people said it's convincing. I'm like, I don't buy it. So the article came out, but then within a month, another paper came out saying, actually, this is not a heart, and here's why. And they picked up on that. The media, I've got sort of a love-hate relationship with it, but there does tend to be a tendency to go for what's, expand on extreme things. If something is too good to be true, there's usually at least some way to make sure that gets through. And if a debunking happens very quick, and so what I noticed with the direwolf news was that very soon after the initial articles, there were reports coming out saying, scientists are questioning this outcome. They didn't say trashing, which is what we were doing, but they it was more, the scientists are not so sure about that. They're calling for caution.
Yeah.
And that's because it happened immediately. It was an immediate outcome. I think that's important.
Definitely.
It's a general problem, is that most in the journalism field aren't trained in the sciences.
Yeah.
But at the same time, very few scientists are trained in journalism.
Exactly. There's a big disconnect.
It is. And so, I got some training in that when I was a postdoc. They taught me how to, it was very useful to me.
Before we run out of time, any final remarks on the whole direwolf media frenzy?
Well, extreme claims are always going to get media attention. The question is, what is the scientific community doing with the results? And are the news media going to continue to cover the process by which we figure out, is this legitimate? Is it not? What are they doing that's right? What are they doing that they're misrepresenting? That's the important part that's not always conveyed. And this time, it looks like they're doing some of that, which is good.
And that was the interview. With these questions answered, hopefully you guys come away with more knowledge about de-extinction and the recent dire wolf media fiasco. This, of course, is just two people's opinions. Ethics is a deeply personal thing, and ultimately it's up to each person to decide for their own what they think of de-extinction. While Colossal did lie and is spending money on something likely to fail, which they know, their achievements are still significant. It isn't very easy, after all, to edit genes. Although they 1000% made those wolves white because of Game of Thrones. They totally did it because of Game of Thrones. I guarantee it.